Welcome to Spooky Halls. On tonight's episode, The Devils Giftshop Part 4 by Doom Dragon 682. Have you ever been in love? Troy had. Though for Troy, love was much less special than it was for many people. Troy fell in and out of love as easily as the wind would blow around dead leaves. In middle school, you couldn't count all of Troy's crushes on both hands and feet. That's not to say Troy was one of those guys who'd sweet talk a woman just to spend the night with them. He always took the time to talk to get and to know whichever guy or girl he had caught his fancy. And so far, his longest relationship had been about a year, and he always did his best to break things cleanly. Most people just said that it was because he just wanted someone to spend time with. His mother would tell you it's because his heart was too big for just one person. And Troy would tell you he just never really connected with anyone for very long. Whatever the real reason, Troy never let a failed relationship put him down. In fact, as he walked home in the dead of night from his job at the library, his head was filled with thoughts of a new co-worker who had caught his fancy. Her name was Alice. She had just started working at the library a few weeks ago. Alice was the type of person who anyone could like. She was polite to everyone she met. She had a good sense of humor and was super smart. Troy did his best to get close to her, and the two were close friends, but things never got any further than that, though Troy never gave up. He could tell that Alice was special, and he even thought she could be the one. Troy was startled out of these thoughts by the tinkling of a small bell. When he looked up, he saw that he was standing in front of a small, dark shop. He had noticed it a few times over the past few days, but didn't take much notice of it. In fact, this was the first time he took notice of the name, the Devils Giftshop. He couldn't help but smile a bit, remembering his religious grandmother who'd likely have a fit over that name. The bell in question was hanging over the door of the shop and had been rang when an older woman hurried out, clutching what seemed to be a picture of Elvis Presley like it was the most valuable thing in the world and couldn't have flown out of her hands at any moment. After a bite, Troy recognized her. She was his old math teacher, who was a well-known fan of Elvis, so her buying a picture of him wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the look of almost manic glee in her eyes. Troy had never seen such a grin, let alone her smile so wide it put the Cheshire Cat to shame. As she hurried down the street, Troy reached out and called her door before it could fully close. Seeing as how he had nothing better to do, why not step in for a bit? Maybe there was something of interest. The interior of the shop was just what you would expect, dim and creepy, with several black candles in the store which gave it a creepy ambience. Tall shelves of various odd items filled the store. He saw shrunken heads and jars of eyes, and even a monkey's paw. As Troy surveyed the store, his eyes fell on a tall glass case, which housed what appeared to be a shriveled human corpse with a mouth twisted open and an internal scream and deep eyeless sockets that seemed to gaze into Troy's soul. He felt an involuntary shiver work its way up his spine and quickly avert his gaze. Though he knew it was unlikely to be real, the mummy made him feel uncomfortable somehow. He took a deep breath to calm himself and return his gaze, but was shocked to see someone now stood a few feet between him and the mummy. The man was tall, about half a foot taller than Troy, and he wore pitch black pants with matching dress shoes. He had a white undershirt and a charcoal gray vest, along with a tie so red it looked soaked in blood and stood out in the white and black of the rest of the man's clothing. His black hair was slicked back, and he had a friendly grin, showing off pearly white teeth. But something about the man's eyes caught Troy off guard. Those piercing blue eyes seemed to gaze straight into Troy, as though they were analyzing his very soul. The man spoke in a deep voice, which put Troy at ease for some reason, and that he couldn't place.
Good evening, sir. Welcome to my shop. What brings you here so late at night?
It took Troy a moment to gather his thoughts enough to respond. I was on my way home from work when I saw your shop. I figured since I didn't have much to do, I'd check it out. The man nodded.
That seems to be how I get most of my customers. Though I suppose I really shouldn't complain. Please, feel free to pursue my wares. If you require assistance, please feel free to call. Oh, sorry, I should introduce myself. My name is Mr. Memphis, owner of this fine establishment.
The man extended a hand, and Troy took it without even thinking. He had been raised to always show good manners, and no matter what. The man's grip was strong, and Troy could tell it could get much stronger. As soon as the shopkeeper let go, he couldn't help but feel uncomfortable, like when you reach into a dark area and feel something unpleasant brush your hand. Mr. Memphis turned and made his way to the counter, and Troy quickly made his way into the shelves. So fast he didn't notice when the mummy turned his head to follow him into the shelves. The shop was full of the kinds of creepy stuff you'd expect. Giant spiders in jars, shrunken heads, a few creepy masks, that kind of stuff. But at the back of the store, Troy felt his attention draw to one shelf in particular. A shelf set apart from the rest with a single light set above it. 3 items rested on the shelf, with 4 empty places between them. He saw a mirror, a medal, and a locket. Though each item was strange in its own right, it was the locket that caught his attention. It was shaped like a heart, and had a strange symbol on the front of it, was just like a heart. But rather than meeting at the top, the points curled onto themselves in a spiral, and a small X rested in the center. Troy lifted the locket and found that it opened. Within was an old faded picture of a woman. She was very beautiful. Curly blonde hair and ruby red lips. Piercing blue eyes seemed to look right at Troy. He admired the necklace for an unknown amount of time before he was startled from his thoughts by a voice.
I see you found our specialty items.
Troy spun around to find Mr. Memphis standing a few feet from him, still with that pleasant smile on his face. I suppose I did. What makes them specialty? Troy swore he saw the man's eyes glint with amusement before he spoke.
Each of those items is rare and unique in its own way. Take the locket you hold in your hands, for example. That locket was made several hundred years ago by a master jeweler. It is said that if you place a picture of the one who you admire, then they shall fall madly in love with you. You'd become inseparable.
Troy felt his eyes widen when the shopkeeper said that. He knew it was probably just a story meant to sell the locket, but at the same time he couldn't stop himself from asking the price. Once again he saw the same glint in the old shopkeeper's eye.
Usually an item this rare would fetch quite the sum. But I can see in your eyes that Cupid's arrow has struck you, and I simply adore young love. Take it for free, young man. I only ask that you give it back after you and your loved are joined. Sound fair?
The deal sounded more than fair to Troy, who quickly agreed and ran out of the store. He ran so fast he didn't see the mummy's empty gaze follow him out the door, and he didn't hear Mr. Memphis chuckle with amusement after the young man. It wasn't until Troy was home that he realized the one flaw in his plan. He had no picture of Alice, so he devised a plan. He'd take a disposable camera to work and take photos of everyone. Say he was trying to make a poster or something to advertise a future event. Lucky for Troy, his plan went off without a hitch. He felt a bit like a creep for having taken the photos, but he pushed those thoughts away and quickly put the picture in the locket. He went to bed, unsure whether or not it would work. That night, Troy had a nightmare. In it, he felt as though something were slowly devouring him. It was some unseen force that felt cold and sharp, like thousands of needles slowly making their way up his body. It paused at his heart before suddenly seeming to focus on just that part. The pain was agonizing, and he thought he'd die, but thankfully he jolted awake before it made it. He was clutching his chest and drenched in sweat. It took a moment for him to catch his breath. By then, the nightmare had all but faded from his mind. Troy did his best to push the feeling of dread from his mind as he excitingly got ready for work, eager to see if the locket had worked. When he arrived at work, Alice greeted him as usual. However, this time their gaze seemed to linger on one another for a beat longer than normal, and he swore her smile seemed to brighten when she saw him. That day, the two sat together during lunch and chatted the whole time. Troy couldn't have been happier about it. It took some time, but soon he and Alice were dating. She'd come over to his apartment often, and they'd spend hours talking or watching TV. But like all things, it began to take a turn for the worse. It started slow. Alice would call him out for looking at other girls, or she'd call him more often than people normally would. He didn't mind the calls, except that they came at inconvenient times, and she usually just wanted to say hi or ask how he was. After that, it escalated to her showing up at his home at random times, and once he even came home to find her already in his house. Apparently, she had made a copy of his key. Troy wasn't sure what to do. He tried telling Alice that he needed space, but she just got angry, claiming that he was seeing someone else or that he wasn't interested in her. This led to a big fight, and they both said things. It ended with Troy kicking Alice out of the house and going to bed with an uneasy feeling in his stomach. Troy woke up with a splitting headache. He tried to rub his head, but found that his hands were tied behind his back. He began to panic and took in his surroundings. He seemed to be in a garage that was empty except for a few boxes. As panic began to settle in Troy's stomach, he heard something from behind. Struggling to turn around, he prepared to yell for help, but the words died in his throat when he saw who was there. It was Alice. She had a manic grin on her once kind face. Her soft blue eyes now seemed hard and cruel. When she spoke, her voice sounded empty and hollow.
Now, dear. You shouldn't struggle. You'll hurt yourself.
Alice! He managed to find his voice. What are you doing? Where are we? She held a finger to his lips.
Shh. Calm down. It's gonna be okay. You see, I can't live without you. Anytime I'm not near you, I feel like myself, like a piece of me is missing. That's why I'm going to make sure we're never apart.
With that, Alice reached into her pocket and removed a spool of thick thread and a large sewing needle. Troy felt the blood drain from his face. He began to plead, but nothing was going to stop Alice. In his final moments, after Alice finished her dark work and he drifted into darkness, he swore he saw Mr. Memphis looming over him. Mr. Memphis smiled down at the sewn-together form in front of him. He truly adored young love. He plucked a locket from the remains and slipped it into his right pocket. As he heard the police sirens, he quickly left the garage and went back to his shop and placed the locket back on the shelf. He chuckled to himself as he thought,
That makes 4. 3 more to go. This is getting fun.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Spooky Halls. If you've enjoyed this video, please make sure to check out our other videos and to subscribe. Thank you and good night.